quietly, deliberately, without asking anyone for permission, without waiting for anyone to open a door, without shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were never designed for her. Usha Vance was not supposed to end up here, not in this particular world, not standing beside one of the most polarizing political figures in modern American history, not navigating the kind of relentless, unforgiving scrutiny that follows you into every room, every event, every quiet morning that is no longer really quiet at all. And yet here she was. But something changed recently. Something subtle, something that caught even people who had been watching her closely completely off guard. Because Usha Vance, a woman who had built her entire public presence on composure, on measured words, on the kind of stillness that makes people lean in rather than push back, began to speak. Not in the carefully managed, rehearsed way that Washington trains people to speak, not in talking points, not in strategy, but honestly, personally. In a way that felt almost disarming coming from someone who had guarded her interior world so completely for so long. She talked about pregnancy, about what her body actually went through, about the strange, heavy emotional landscape of becoming a mother while the world watched and judged and filled in the gaps with whatever story it preferred. She talked about what life as second lady genuinely feels like from the inside, not the ceremonial version, not the press release version, the real one. The one that has actual weight to it, actual exhaustion, actual complexity beneath the polished surface. And people listened, not casually, closely. Because something in her words did not sound like a political wife managing an image. It sounded like a woman who simply wanted to be understood on her own terms as her own person. That distinction is not small. And once you sit with what she actually said, and what it quietly costs a woman in her position to say it at all, you may find yourself looking at her story in a way you never quite expected. There is a particular kind of woman who moves through difficult rooms without making a sound, not because she has nothing to say, not because she is passive or afraid or without opinion, but because somewhere along the way she learned deep in her bones, without anyone having to explain it, that silence can carry its own kind of power. That restraint used carefully is not weakness. It is a form of control that very few people ever truly master. Usha Vance grew up in a home shaped entirely by immigration and the particular kind of ambition that comes with it. Her parents arrived from India carrying something that no suitcase could hold, a discipline rooted in the understanding that in a new country, you earn every inch of the space you occupy. You do not complain about how hard it is. You do not make a spectacle of your struggle. You study, you work, you build steadily without waiting for someone to tell you that you belong. And Usha built. She was exceptional in school, not in the showy, performative way, but in the way of someone who genuinely absorbs the world around her, who finds real meaning in ideas and arguments and the slow, careful process of understanding something deeply. She went to Yale as an undergraduate, then to Cambridge, then back to Yale for law school. She moved through some of the most intellectually demanding institutions on earth, and she did not emerge from them hardened or self-important. She emerged refined. There was always a quietness to her that people around her noticed, a stillness that was not cold but considered. It was inside that world at Yale Law School that she first encountered J.D. Vance, a young man from Appalachian, Ohio, who was trying to make sense of the enormous distance between where he had come from and where he was now standing. They were, at first glance, an unlikely pair. She, the daughter of South Indian immigrants, carrying one kind of American story. He, shaped by a working-class Rust Belt upbringing, carrying an entirely different one. But something between them clicked in a way that defied easy categorization. Something that would quietly reshape both of their lives in directions neither could have mapped out at the time. They married, they built a family together. 3 children arrived, Ewan, Vivek, and Mirabel. And while J.D. moved into writing, then public commentary, then politics, then national prominence, Usha did not step back. She continued practicing law. She joined a prestigious firm. She maintained her career with the same seriousness she had brought to everything else. She was not a woman waiting in someone else's shadow. She had built her own lane and she stayed in it. But then, without warning, the lane changed entirely. When J.D. Vance became Donald Trump's running mate in 2024, the world Usha had carefully constructed shifted beneath her feet. Overnight, she was no longer simply a successful attorney with a private life she had chosen and protected. She was a public figure, a symbol, a target depending entirely on who was doing the looking. And she handled it the way she seemed to handle everything, calmly, composedly, without visible fracture. But composure has a cost that does not show on the surface. And recently, for the very first time, the world got a glimpse of what that cost actually looks like from somewhere real. Before the cameras found her, before the rallies and the motorcades and the events scheduled around someone else's ambitions, before the title of Second Lady was even a possibility she had to seriously consider, there was simply Usha, a woman, a person. Someone with her own interior life and her own professional identity, and her own relationship with what success should feel like. It is one of the more quietly damaging things that happens to people when they enter public life. The way the world collapses everything they were before into the single role they now occupy. The way it forgets or chooses not to care that there was a full and complex person standing there long before the spotlight arrived. Usha Vance has resisted that collapse. Quietly but with a firmness that has never really wavered. People who worked alongside her during her years in law speak of someone who was genuinely, authentically engaged with the work. Not performing dedication, not building a professional image for future use. Actually passionate about legal reasoning, about the careful architecture of an argument. About what it means to fight for something inside a system that does not always reward that kind of conviction. She worked on significant cases. She earned genuine respect in rooms where respect is not given out as a courtesy. She was, by every honest measure, a serious professional with a serious career that she had built entirely through her own effort. And she was doing all of this while raising 3 children. 3 children in a world that still places an enormous, largely invisible burden on mothers, particularly mothers who also hold demanding careers. The logistics of that life alone are almost incomprehensible to anyone who hasn't lived it. The early mornings that begin before the rest of the house wakes. The school pickups rearranged around court schedules, the sick days that arrive without warning. The homework, the dinner, the bedtime routines, the emotional labor that runs underneath everything else like a current that never actually stops. She carried all of that, quietly. While also being married to a man who was, increasingly, at the absolute center of one of the most polarizing political movements in recent American history. That is not a small thing to carry. That is an enormous weight. There were moments, according to people who knew the family during those years, when Usha's own identity seemed genuinely at risk of being absorbed entirely by the narrative surrounding her husband. Media coverage had a way of reducing her to a descriptor, the Indian-American wife, the lawyer spouse, the softening contrast to J.D.'s rougher-edge story. As if her primary function in the public imagination was to explain him, to contextualize him, to make him easier for certain audiences to accept. She never appeared to accept that framing. But she also never fought it loudly, never made a scene about it, never demanded that the narrative change. Instead, she simply maintained herself. She showed up. She gave interviews rarely, chose every word with visible care, and kept the most personal parts of her life somewhere that public consumption could not reach. That restraint, sustained over years, told a story of its own, of a woman who understood with quiet clarity that the moment you give the modern media landscape a real opening, it will fill that opening with whatever story it arrived wanting to tell. So she gave it very little until something shifted. There is a moment in the life of almost every public figure when the wall between the personal and the political simply gives way, not because they chose to tear it down, but because the world decided on their behalf that it should no longer stand. For Usha Vance, that moment arrived through pregnancy. She had moved through her pregnancies before J.D.'s political ascent largely away from public view. They were private experiences, held close, not offered up for commentary or analysis. But the national conversation around pregnancy, and around reproductive rights more broadly, became one of the most charged, combustible political battlefields of the entire 2024 election cycle. And suddenly, without having done anything to invite it, Usha's lived experience as a mother, as a woman who had carried and delivered children, was no longer simply personal memory. It had become political territory, something people felt entitled to reference, to interpret, to use, and so, according to reports, she began to speak about it. Not in the language of a policy position, not in the careful, defensive way of someone managing a public relations moment, but in the simple, direct language of someone describing something they actually lived through. She spoke about what pregnancy physically felt like. About the vulnerability of it. A vulnerability that does not negotiate with your level of education or your career achievements or the resources available to you. She spoke about the particular fear that lives quietly inside every pregnancy, the awareness that the body is doing something enormous and uncertain, and that no amount of preparation fully closes the distance between you and that uncertainty. You are, in those moments, more exposed than you have ever been, and no professional credential in the world changes that. This was not a talking point. It did not sound like one. It sounded like something that had come from somewhere real inside her, something she had held privately for a long time and was only now allowing into the open air. For women who had lived through pregnancy themselves, who understood that particular combination of joy and fear and physical exhaustion and emotional exposure, something in her words landed with unusual force. Not because she said anything revolutionary, but because she said it honestly, without softening it into something easier to hear, without converting her experience into a political argument. People felt it, not just her supporters, not just people already inclined to see her in a favorable light. People who had never paid particular attention to her before found themselves unexpectedly moved by something in the way she spoke. Because what they heard was not a public figure performing relatability, what they heard was recognition, the real kind, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. The office of Second Lady of the United States carries almost no formal institutional power. There is no defined portfolio, no constitutional authority, no specific mandate. What it carries instead is an enormous and largely unspoken weight of expectation, a standard that is never clearly articulated but is nonetheless always being silently applied. You are not the First Lady. You do not have that level of visibility, that degree of global recognition, that particular depth of institutional infrastructure surrounding you. But you are still watched constantly, still photographed, still analyzed and commented on and held up against expectations you were never formally told about, by people who feel entirely comfortable having opinions about your choices, your appearance, your tone, your level of warmth or reserve or ambition. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life building something genuinely independent, a professional reputation earned through her own work, an identity rooted in her own accomplishments, a sense of self that did not depend on who she was standing next to, stepping into this role required a particular kind of adjustment that most people never have to make. She has spoken about it, according to multiple reports, with striking clarity, about the way the rhythm of political life operates on a schedule that belongs to someone else's priorities. The travel that accumulates, the events that fill the calendar. The requirement to be present, composed, warm, and entirely appropriate across an endless series of occasions that were not designed with her comfort in mind, that are not really about her at all. And that she must nonetheless show up to as if she is fully present, not depleted, not distracted. Not carrying whatever weight she was carrying at 6 in the morning into the room where she is expected to be smiling, and engaged at 7 in the evening. This is work that has no official title. It does not appear on a resume. Most people looking at the photographs from those events would never guess at the sustained effort underneath them. Usha addressed it honestly, not with bitterness. Her tone, by all accounts, was not that, but with the clear-eyed, unembellished acknowledgement of someone who has decided that pretending the difficulty doesn't exist serves no one. She described the reality of it as it actually is, stripped of the glamour that people on the outside tend to project onto lives like hers. She spoke, too, with particular care, about raising children inside this particular kind of public world. About the tension that does not really resolve between wanting her kids to understand and be proud of what their father does, and wanting to protect them from the more brutal, more personal edges of public life, the cruelty that sometimes gets directed not at policies or positions, but at people. At families, at children who did not choose any of this. That tension, she said, is something you learn to hold, not something you ever fully put down. There was something in the way she talked about her children that changed the quality of the room, a warmth that was not performed for the camera, a concern that was specific and genuine. She is not simply a second lady navigating a role. She is a mother, trying to protect something fragile and irreplaceable inside a world that was not built to accommodate that kind of tenderness. At some point in every conversation about Usha Vance, something rises quietly to the surface that no one quite knows how to address directly. She is the first South Asian American second lady in the history of the United States. That is not a detail. That is a genuinely historic reality, one that carries meaning whether she chooses to make it the center of her story or not. And she has not made it the center. She has not used her heritage as a political instrument, has not positioned herself as a symbol or a spokesperson for a community, has not allowed the significance of what she represents to be converted into a campaign asset, even in moments when there was clearly external pressure to do so. But she has also not pretended the complexity is not there. In speaking about her pregnancies, about her family, about the particular texture of her life, she touched on something that children of immigrants often carry in ways that are difficult to fully translate to people who didn't grow up with it. The specific weight of knowing that your parents gave up enormous things, comfort, recognition, proximity to everyone they loved, so that you could have the life you now have. The way that knowledge shapes your relationship with ambition, with setbacks, with what it means to succeed or to fail. The sense that your achievements carry someone else's sacrifice inside them always. She spoke about her parents, people who arrived in this country holding credentials that weren't recognized here, who navigated a culture that did not always extend its warmth easily, who built something stable and meaningful, and lasting through sheer persistence and quiet dignity. People who taught her not through lectures but through the example of their own lives that where you come from is not a limitation to be explained or apologized for. It is a foundation. Something real to stand on. And then she placed that foundation against the landscape of where she was now standing inside the second highest household in American political life. And she seemed to sit with the full complexity of that contrast without rushing to resolve it into something neater or simpler than it actually is. Because it is genuinely complex. A woman whose parents built their lives here as immigrants now moves through a political world that has had some of the most contentious, most painful public debates about immigration in living memory. She carries that complexity visibly. She does not pretend the tension isn't real. But she also does not allow other people to define what that tension means for her, or to tell her what she is supposed to feel about the world she now inhabits. That is a quiet but significant act of self-determination. In the environment surrounding her, in the world she now moves through every single day, it takes more than people might realize. For everything Usha Vance has finally allowed into the open, there is still a great deal she has chosen to hold back. And perhaps that remaining silence is the most revealing part of all. She has been careful, consistently, deliberately careful, about the line between what she is willing to share and what belongs only to her. In a moment in public life when figures are expected to offer everything, when vulnerability has become a content strategy and authenticity is something that gets manufactured and packaged, her decision to maintain certain silences feels almost radical. Almost old-fashioned in the best possible sense. She has not spoken in detail about the more turbulent chapters of her husband's public life, about the controversies that have surrounded him, about what it feels like to sit with criticism that is not directed at policies or positions, but at the people you love most, at your character, your choices, your children. She has not spoken about the internal landscape of a marriage in which one person's ambition has fundamentally reshaped the shared life that both people live, the conversations behind closed doors, the things quietly given up, the adjustments that accumulate over time and never appear in any press release. These are the silences that still surround her. And in some ways, they say more than anything she has said out loud. Because a woman who actively decides what she will reveal and what she will protect, who chooses with intention rather than simply pouring herself out for public consumption, is a woman who has not surrendered herself to the role she now occupies. Somewhere underneath all of it, she is still making her own choices, still protecting her own inner life, still, in whatever quiet space remains available to her, her own person. That is harder than it looks. In a world that always wants more than you've given, that treats the private lives of public figures as a form of public property, that will keep asking and keep pressing and keep filling in the silences with its own preferred stories. Choosing what to withhold is its own kind of quiet courage. Questions remain that she has not answered, about how she holds together the tensions between her background and the political world she now inhabits, about what she envisions for herself beyond this particular chapter, about who she actually is in the moments when no one is watching, when it is just her, somewhere quiet, deciding what she really thinks and really feels about the life she is living. Those answers may come with time, or they may not. She is not obligated to give them, and she seems to know that. But the questions themselves tell a story, about how completely we projected onto her before we knew anything real, about how little of her actual self the public has ever genuinely had access to. about how easily we convince ourselves that seeing someone means we understand them. There is a particular kind of person who steps into public life without ever fully giving themselves to it, who participates without surrendering, who speaks without oversharing, who shows up consistently, reliably, graciously, and yet somehow manages to remain, underneath all of it, stubbornly and quietly themselves. Usha Vance appears to be that kind of person. And what she has chosen to reveal recently, about pregnancy, about the emotional and logistical reality of life as second lady, about identity and the weight of her parents' sacrifice, and the complexity of occupying a historic position she never asked to be symbolic of, was not a dramatic confession. It was not a media strategy, it was not a pivot or a rebranding. It felt to many people who encountered it like something far simpler and far rarer than any of that. It felt like honesty. The real kind, not the kind that arrives with fanfare or that announces itself. The kind that settles in quietly after the conversation ends. When you are sitting alone somewhere and you realize that something in what she said reflected something true, something about what it actually costs to live a life that is always being watched, always being interpreted, always being held up against a standard no one ever clearly defined. We tend to look at people in positions like hers and assume that proximity to power means proximity to ease. That the formal dinners and the security details and the private travel and the grand rooms mean that life has become lighter somehow, more certain, more cushioned against the ordinary difficulties that most people navigate without ceremony or assistance. But her words suggested something different, something more honest. That the higher the position, the more exposed you actually become. That visibility and vulnerability do not cancel each other out, they arrive together, inseparably, every single time. That even inside the most formal, most gilded version of public life, a woman is still moving through the same fundamental questions about who she is, what she owes to the people around her, and what, if anything, she is allowed to keep for herself. She has not answered all of those questions publicly, she may never. But the fact that she is sitting with them honestly, without pretending they are resolved, without performing certainty she does not have, says something about her character that no official title ever could. Whatever you think of the political world she now inhabits, whatever your own position on the larger story surrounding her, there is something in Usha Vance's story that exists outside all of that. Something human. Something about ambition and sacrifice, and the complexity of being a woman in a world that is constantly trying to define you before you've had the chance, or the quiet, to define yourself. She is still, it seems, in the middle of that work. And that, more than any single revelation, is what makes her story genuinely worth sitting with. If something in this story stayed with you, if it made you stop and think, even briefly, about identity or sacrifice, or what it really costs to live a life that is always being watched, we would love to hear what you're thinking in the comments below. Stories like this one deserve more than headlines. They deserve real, honest conversation. And if you want more storytelling that goes beneath the surface, that takes its time and treats its subjects with genuine care, subscribe and stay close. There is always another story worth telling.